Hello, my name is Jazz Martinez, and today I'll be exploring a question that connects both science and philosophy. Can neuroscience fully explain the mind? Have you ever stopped to think about what's actually happening inside your head right now? How you're able to listen, imagine, and feel all at once? Neuroscience would say it's neurons. Billions of tiny cells firing electrical signals, creating thoughts, emotions, even your sense of self. But is that really it? Or is there something more? Something beyond the physical? Something that can't be seen under a microscope? That's the question at the heart of today's talk. Can neuroscience truly explain the brain, and by extension, the mind? This is more than a scientific question. It's a metaphysical one. It challenges how we define reality, self, and consciousness itself. When we look at the brain, we're not just studying an organ. We're looking at the place where science and philosophy meet. What is neuroscience? Neuroscience is a study of the brain and nervous system, how it processes information, stores memory, and creates behavior. But what's fascinating is that neuroscience actually began as a philosophical curiosity. In the 1800s, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, sometimes called the father of modern neuroscience, used simple staining techniques to reveal that the brain is made up of separate cells called neurons, instead of one big continuous network, which was the belief at the time. Imagine how revolutionary that was. The idea that the mind could be studied through the physical structures of the brain. Then there was Paul Broca, who studied a patient known as Tan. The man could understand language, but could only say the word tan. After he died, Broca discovered damage in one small area of his brain, now known as Broca's area. That discovery showed that specific parts of the brain control specific mental abilities, linking thought and biology directly. It's discoveries like these that began to close the gap between body and mind, something philosophers had debated for centuries. But as neuroscience grew, it also sparked new questions. If thoughts come from neurons, where does the self fit in? Are we more than electrical patterns? The history of neuroscience. The word neuroscience didn't even exist until the mid-20th century. Before that, scientists and philosophers worked separately. Doctors studied the brain as an organ, and philosophers debated the nature of the mind. It wasn't until the invention of new technologies like the microscope, the EEG, and later brain imaging, that neuroscience truly became its own field. In the 1950s, researchers began to connect psychology, biology, and chemistry, creating what we now call cognitive neuroscience. This field brought together scientists like Eric Kandel, who studied how memory forms in neurons, and Brenda Milner, who worked with a patient known as HM. Her work revealed that different parts of the brain handle different types of memory, showing how complex and specialized our minds really are. These discoveries started to bridge the gap between the physical brain and the mysterious nature of the mind, a gap that philosophers had been arguing about for centuries. How neuroscience explains behavior. Today, neuroscience can explain more human behavior than ever before. Your prefrontal cortex helps you plan, make moral decisions, and resist temptation. Your amygdala helps you detect danger and process emotion. And your hippocampus stores memories, connecting the past to the present. For instance, when you hear your favorite song and suddenly feel nostalgic, it's not random. Your hippocampus is lighting up and linking memory and emotion. Or when you feel a rush of happiness after succeeding at something, that's dopamine, your brain's built-in reward system. Neuroscience gives us these clear, measurable explanations for why we act and feel the way we do. But here's where metaphysics comes back in. Even if we can explain how emotions happen, can we ever explain why they feel like something? We can measure a fear response, but that doesn't tell us what it feels like to be afraid. That gap between the physical process and the inner experience is where science meets mystery. The mind-body problem. This brings us to one of the oldest questions in philosophy, the mind-body problem. Back in the 1600s, René Descartes argued for dualism, the belief that the mind and body are made of two different substances. He famously said, "I think, therefore I am." For Descartes, our mental health, our thoughts, feelings, and consciousness couldn't be reduced to physical matter. But modern neuroscience takes the opposite view, physicalism, that everything about the mind can ultimately be explained by the physical brain. So when you feel love, anger, or creativity, neuroscience says that's your brain firing in complex patterns. But metaphysics asks, is that really the whole story? Even with brain scans, we can't explain why those patterns produce experience. This is what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. We can explain how light enters your eyes and your brain registers the color red, but we can't explain why red looks or feels the way it does, why it has a redness to it. That's the metaphysical puzzle. How does matter become mind? It's one of the greatest unsolved questions in both science and philosophy. Can science explain consciousness? Neuroscience has made huge progress in understanding the brain, but consciousness remains elusive. Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA, believed that consciousness was simply the behavior of neurons, that one day science would explain it completely. He called this the astonishing hypothesis. The idea that you, your joys, and your sorrows are nothing more than the activity of nerve cells. But metaphysicians argue that consciousness might be something more, something fundamental. There's even a theory called panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness could be a basic feature of the universe, that even atoms have tiny sparks of awareness. It sounds wild, but it's gaining attention among modern philosophers because it tries to answer a question neuroscience hasn't yet solved. Why does physical matter ever become aware of itself? Maybe, instead of the brain producing consciousness, it's like radio receiving it, tuning into a deeper field of awareness that science can't yet measure. These are the kinds of ideas that keeps metaphysics relevant, because they remind us that not every mystery can be solved in a lab. The future of neuroscience. Technology keeps pushing the boundaries of what we can know about the brain. With fMRI, we can see which parts of the brain activate during decisions, empathy, or memory. Scientists can even predict someone's choice a few seconds before they consciously make it, based on brain activity alone. If your brain decides before you're aware of it, do you really have free will? Philosopher Daniel Dennett argues that free will still exists, just in a more complex way. He says it's not about defying physics, but about how our brain integrates experiences and makes informed, flexible choices. Others, however, see this as evidence that free will is an illusion, that we're just observers watching the brain do its work. Either way, neuroscience doesn't just study neurons. It challenges our most basic beliefs about freedom, identity, and what it means to be a human. Where science meets mystery. So, Can neuroscience explain the brain? It can explain how we think, how we feel, and how we act. But metaphysics reminds us that explaining how doesn't always explain why. Why does consciousness exist at all? Why does something physical give rise to something so personal, the feeling of being you? Maybe neuroscience will one day bridge that gap. Or maybe, as philosopher Thomas Nagel suggested, consciousness will always be something that can only be experienced, not described. Neuroscience tells us how life works. Metaphysics asks what life means. And by understanding the brain isn't about solving the mystery. It's about learning to appreciate it. Thank you for listening.